Welcome, everybody. I'm Roseanne Bain, Assistant Superintendent at CiTi BOCES, and I am super excited to be here with you all today to give you your first dive into New York Inspires, which is the New York State Education Department's new initiative for transforming learning in New York State schools. To give you a little background about myself, I was a teacher in Altmar Parish Williamstown Central School District, teaching English and social studies for about 13 years. And I now have been in education for 33 years, in administration ever since 2005. But I probably would not have become an administrator in 2005 if New York Inspires existed. Because when I decided to become an administrator, it's because APW had to shut down a program that I was teaching in that was highly innovative, a class which was called Humanities. And it combined English and social studies into the same classroom with the same kids, with project-based learning. And a new mandate came out called Academic Intervention Services, and it wreaked havoc with the schedule at APW. So Humanities had to end. And when Humanities ended, teaching wasn't quite as fun. I felt like my hands had been tied when it came to creativity. So what I know about New York Inspires is that this is actually an incredible opportunity for teachers, especially if you ever felt like your hands were tied when it came to creativity. So today, we're going to talk about a lot of things, and some of those things might feel disruptive. And that is supposed to feel that way. This is a systems change. It's not simply an add-on to our education system. This is a redefinition of the purpose of learning and education in New York State. New York Inspires challenges us to move away from those really traditional content-heavy models and compliance models. Instead, we are supposed to be moving forward with prioritizing deeper learning, student agency and autonomy, and real-world relevance. A thinking lens for all of you today. Try not to think about how you're going to make these changes in your classroom today, because that could be overwhelming and it could feel disruptive. Instead, be thinking about how these transformations might change your classroom in the future. This presentation is separated into segments, and each school district will be stopping the presentation at various times. The first segment is, how did we get here? Why do we even have to have a change? There's many people who feel like a change is not necessary. But the data tells us that change and transformation is necessary in New York State schools. So there's something called the Blue Ribbon Commission. Many of you might have heard of it. It was started in 2019. And that commission brought together individuals and stakeholders from every imaginable group you could think of. Students, teachers, college professors, industry, parents, higher education, and they all faced coming up with a plan for New York State, coming up with a way to transform education, and determining what areas of our system actually needed to be reformed or transformed. So what needed to change? What could stay the same? So after meeting for approximately 3 years, the Blue Ribbon Commission provided a final report to the Board of Regents. In November of 2024, when the Blue Ribbon Commission presented this plan that they had come up with, an area of priorities to the Board of Regents. The Board of Regents then reviewed all of the data, and they sent out suggestions to the field and asked for feedback. And after several months of feedback came in through thought exchange, the Board of Regents came up with New York Inspires. New York Inspires are the transformations that were determined to be the most important transformations. The Board of Regents did this by taking in data from the Blue Ribbon Commission and from the public. So New York Inspires is a systems change. It isn't just a one-off initiative. And that systems change leads to 4 transformations. And those 4 transformations are: New York State would be adopting a New York State portrait of a graduate. 2, redefining credits and learning experiences, including time and what is mandated for time. 3, it's going to sunset diploma assessment requirements. And 4, move to 1 high school diploma in New York State. So this is the background. But many people will stop and say, but why, Roseanne? Why do we need to have such extreme change? Well, the why has to do a lot with kids. With, first off, all the research that was shared and showed in New York State through many sources, that in our state we have an opportunity and resource inequity in our schools. And that's based on 2 things. 1, your zip code causes inequity when it comes to the types of programs that might be available in your district versus another district, the type of extracurricular activities that might be available, et cetera. And then it was found that there was an identity inequity in New York State schools. The identity inequity is that if you happen to be a student in a particular group, your chances of success and graduation in New York State were greatly diminished by your identity. And those identities included students with disabilities, students of color, students who were English language learners. So your zip code and your identity were having a dramatic impact on whether or not you could be successful and have equitable experiences in New York State. A second reason was we have this outdated compliance system, meaning that we are one of the only states left that has a dual compliance system, meaning every student needed 22 credits to graduate, and they have to pass 5 Regents exams. It's like a double-edged sword. The majority of states, students simply need credits to graduate. Another thing was college and career readiness. Lots of input from stakeholders at the college level and from the industry level saying New York State graduates aren't quite ready for the types of students that are needed at college and the types of employees that are needed in 21st century occupations. The 4th reason is students saying, my education has a lack of authenticity. I don't have any choice. This one is all about that inevitable question that is asked all the time about when you are presenting information to your students and they say, when am I ever going to use this? A key part of New York Inspires is that when lessons are developed, teachers can answer that question for students about when they can use what they're learning in authentic situations. And finally, there's been inconsistent K-12 coherence and alignment. And that's what led to the portrait of the graduate. So the portrait of the graduate is actually what is going to provide that consistency and coherence and alignment in grades K-12 for all students in New York State. So very rarely does anybody, say, oh yeah, New York State Education Department, they're so flexible. So you might be thinking, this is never going to happen. If I'm a couple years away from, retirement, maybe I'll just sit back and, I'll watch this one happen. But in fact, New York Inspires is going to replace one right way with supported, flexible, multiple pathways. And this is a system that is designed for flexibility, which anybody who's been in the New York State education system long enough knows that doesn't sound like our system. But we are going from a system of compliance to a system of competency or readiness. So this is a fundamental change to the design of education in New York State. So what is New York Inspires? New York Inspires is a shift in how learning is demonstrated. It's a broader definition of readiness. Being ready is not the same for everybody. An emphasis is now on transfer and application. And transfer means, how do you take what you know or what you learned, and can you transfer it to authentic or unknown situations? And this isn't a one-off. It is a phased regulatory evolution of a system. But you may have heard lots of things about New York Inspires. It is not the elimination of assessments. It's not the elimination of the Regents exams. It definitely does not lower standards. It's not a rejection of strong content knowledge, and it's not the elimination of academic rigor. So as we go through this training, I believe you'll learn more about how New York Inspires can actually inspire and transform you as educators. Our next segment is about time and transformations. Trust me, it's understood that all of our teachers and our teaching assistants are working really hard right now with students. And so getting information about a transformation of a system can seem very overwhelming. So it's important for everybody to understand that this is a phased-in system. Things you're going to learn about today are not all going to happen right away. So here is the phased approach. The planning year was the fall of 2024 to the summer of 2025. Some of you might have missed that. That is actually a planning year for the state. We are all now in what is called Phase 1 installation. This is a 2-year time period in which we are installing the ideas of the 4 transformations in our schools. The initial implementation of this system begins in the fall of 2027, and that initial implementation goes right through the summer of 2029. Phase 3 is full implementation and scaling things up, and that happens in the fall of 2029. So New York Inspires is not 4 separate initiatives. It is one phased-in system of transformation. And each transformational area places different resource considerations on districts at different points in the timeline. So that's why the state is giving us this time, beginning with your district today, to really start thinking about how New York Inspires can positively impact your district and your students. So those 4 transformations, we mentioned them earlier, but to reiterate them, we are adopting a New York State Portrait of a Graduate, which already happened and was released in the fall of 2025. Redefining credits in learning experiences, which is currently happening right now. The sunsetting of diploma assessments and requirements, which is a hot button issue that a lot of people have heard about. And moving to one New York State diploma. So when do these things happen? Now this slide is a lot more words than I normally would have on a slide, but in previous presentations, people have told me they love this slide. So this is a slide from New York State, except I added the class of parts on the left-hand side, because people sometimes get confused about cohorts. And knowing a cohort is when someone entered 9th grade. So if we took a look at this and we pause for a moment and just kind of pay attention to this slide, it tells you how it will impact, changes can impact our current students. So our current 11th and 12th graders are under all of the current diploma requirements, meaning they need both the 22 credit hours and the 5 Regents exams or 5 assessments in order to graduate. Now, there are some folks that are like, that seems a little unfair. The students that came before these kids had COVID exemptions, and the students after them, the students that are currently in 10th grade, for example, are not going to have Regents assessments to graduate. The one exemption that is available for this group, the students that are currently in 11th and 12th grade, is New York State approved in May of last year that eligible students can request an exemption due to a major life event. And determining what a major life event is up to the superintendents at each school. So if we go further down to the next color, cohorts 2024 through 2026, as far as thinking about current high schoolers, that's your current 9th and 10th graders and your 8th graders at the middle school. For those students, we are going to be going from 3 diplomas down to 1. So the class of 2027-28, they will be the first group that gets 1 diploma, but there will still be an advanced designation as a seal of distinction available. They still will have to get the 22 credits that are the current requirement, but the diploma assessment requirement will be decoupled in the fall of 2027. So that means when the current 10th graders are seniors, they will not have to have the 5 assessments as a required measurement of graduation. They are decoupled. Now, when we talk about moving further down, the classes of 31, 32, which are the 2027, 2028 cohorts, they will be 1 diploma, but will have new seals and new endorsements that can go on that diploma. Our new credit requirements will be out for that group, so kids that are currently in 6th and 7th grade. And diploma assessment requirements are sunset. So some people are like, what's the difference between decoupling and sunsetting? So decoupling is they're removed from being a graduation requirement. The exams have to be decoupled before they can be sunset. Sunsetting is that those assessments become optional. They can still be used, especially to perhaps assess students' content knowledge, but they can't be used singly or alone as the only thing that determines whether or not a student has met a standard. And finally, our current 5th graders. Students who are in 5th grade and beyond are the first group that will be in the totally redesigned system. And at that point, in the fall of 2029, we will be converting to 1 statewide transcript for all students. So if you aren't a high school teacher or a high school TA, et cetera, you might not know that transcripts for high school students around the state look different in every district. So there's going to be 1 transcript required, and that is a huge lift as well. So these are the diploma requirements by cohort. And as you can see, once again, it's a phased-in system. Everything isn't going to happen at exactly the same time. But you might sit back and say, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for me today? What does it mean for me tomorrow? So know that right now you're in that installation phase. During that installation phase, there really has to be a mindset change. You have to bring on hearts and minds about these changes. So at this time, in this 2025 through 2027 time period, you and school districts should be working on fully adopting and understanding the portrait of a graduate, be having conversations about awareness of the 4 transformations, having alignment conversations. Where in my current class do I already have authentic assessment? And where could I perhaps add some authentic assessment? What other early adoption activities could we be doing? There are some people who are very, very excited about this already, and they're ready to adopt. There are others who will need more time for the installation phase. When we get to the initial implementation, which is that time period after the summer of 2027, there will be a lot more guidance and support that has been released by the state. And that is when we will be, happily welcoming credit flexibility, assessment changes, and diploma alignment. So you do have time. Nothing changes overnight. This timeline is deliberate and phased. So the first transformation of the 4 transformation is the portrait of the graduate. And this portrait of a graduate is the anchor for regulatory change, not an add-on. It sets the destination for all students grades K through 12. This is going to lend itself to the coherence of the entire system. The portrait looks like this. So if we take a few moments to just kind of take this slide in, you'll see that there are 6 essential areas that surround the bullseye. And the bullseye is culturally responsive, sustaining education. That is always the focus. And then there are 6 specific areas that a New York State graduate will be ready to learn, grow, create, work, and contribute. And this will only happen by the scaffolding of these skills from elementary through high school. And obviously, any of us looking at these 6 areas, we might feel like there's nothing earth-shattering here. These are things we already hope for all children, that they're academically prepared, that they're creative innovators, that they'll be critical thinkers, that they'll be effective communicators and global citizens, and that they are absolutely going to be future ready. Because let's face it, we don't even know exactly what jobs we're preparing students for. So when we take a look at these 6 areas, there's more in-depth opportunities to really analyze and think about what these 6 dispositions really mean. During this training, we're not diving into them, but your district will be diving into these 6 dispositions. And this is language that you could start using right now with your students to say what we're doing right now makes you a better critical thinker. It makes you an effective communicator. These are words that we could be using in this installation period to make the language of the portrait of the graduate more commonplace for everybody. Now, sometimes when we hear something like portrait of a graduate, we might feel like, well, this is all about high school. But in fact, it's not. And the fact that this is systemic is very well seen when we think about the portrait of the graduate and New York Inspires through this lens. The elementary is building the base. Whether students are going to be ready in high school is strongly determined by whether their base is built. So sometimes people will be like, oh, it sounds like, kids still need to know how to read and do math, and a lot of the things you're talking about with flexibility and with, time limits going away and other things make me worry. Are we still going to have that centralized concern about literacy? And in fact, folks, the elementary still builds that base. Literacy and numeracy remain central. There's habits of the mind being built. Kids' thinking starts to become visible, and they receive feedback that fuels their growth. And under New York Inspires, assessment is to support students' growth, not defining a student's growth. And as with many things, middle school will then expand that capacity. It will scaffold up the portrait of the graduate. And we're still doing that core instruction, and the habits of mind are being, strengthened through the challenges that middle school teachers will put forth. And students are able to explore things they're passionate about, or they think they're passionate about, with an increased freedom. And at this point, students really should be taking more autonomy and agency and tracking their own growth and agency over their own pathways and making determinations about, what they may want to do when they exit high school. And high school's job is going to be, seated in demonstrating that readiness. So the rigor at the high school, of course, is still going to come through content, but content application takes center stage at the high school level. The habits in mind are applied in complex contexts Thinking is consistently applied to real-world problems. Students need to demonstrate and defend their readiness. And multiple measures of readiness will be available to students. So that means there isn't just one test that's taken on the same day by all students. And that might be a growing pain for many of us who came up through a more traditional system. So assessment is an area that when I present to teacher groups, that one that they're often very concerned about. They've heard things like the Regents exams are going to be eliminated, but that is not the case. So let's take a few moments to really talk about what assessment looks like in a system like New York Inspires. Assessments must measure more than what a student knows. They must measure what a student can do with what they know. And I know from my time as a teacher, I often was focused on what kids knew. But instead, there need to be multiple assessment pathways and performance-based evidence for students in their learning. So that means capstone projects, portfolios, internships, community service, project and problem-based learning, actual application in authentic manners. Folks are like, but Regences have a strong and storied history in New York State. I feel like they have made us stand out as being producing students that are more academically prepared than other states. In fact, we're not finding amongst colleges and universities that students who have taken Regents exams are actually better prepared for college and career than other students. But yet the Regents exams do have a value. So understand that Regents exams are not being eliminated. However, they're no longer going to be used as the high school exit requirement. So really, Regents exams should be reframed as a resource rather than the end game or the whole purpose of a course. Whether or not you use a Regents exam as one of the measures of learning in your classroom will be a local decision. The state is not saying that Regents exams have to be used in Regents classes. There isn't that idea that some classes are Regents level and some are not is something that has to be reframed. So Regents exams can still be used as one indicator among multiple measures of readiness. However, we understand that many Regents exams have design limitations, as do most large-scale standardized exams. Now, there's some people saying, wait, we've got these whole new science things going on with science standards and new science Regences, and I think the measure of what exams actually provide authentic learning needs to be locally determined. But with New York Inspires, whether you choose to use Regents exams or not, as instructors, as school districts, you have to be able to say that students can demonstrate transfer. And Regences typically on their own can't demonstrate transfer. They do not measure the transfer of content to authentic situations. But it's important to know that both pathways can be honored. It is a local decision. I'm going to just step back to say, when I was teaching high school English and social studies, and I was teaching 11th grade, and I was responsible for the U.S. history regions, and I was responsible for the English regions, and when those tests were taken, my principal would bring me into his office, and he would check my pass rates, and really my value as a teacher was often measured by those tests. And I did a lot of my planning around how I could help make kids successful on the Regents exams. It's hard to step back and say, the way that I have been told to teach or what was important is changing. But I think it's like time to like really take a positive viewpoint on the idea that a test should not be the reason for our classes, for our coursework. And instead, it's learning, right? And learning things that can be transferred. So you can take a traditional and a transfer-based assessment approach. Both pathways could be honored if you as a district or you decided to do that. But creativity and motivation for students comes from transfer-based assessments. So transfer-based assessments are tasks where a student's ability to apply what they've learned in a new situation, in an authentic situation, or an unfamiliar situation is measured rather than simply recalling information. I say to folks, take a moment to step back and say, what is the best way to measure learning and standards and competency and readiness in my content area? So what could districts be doing now? Well, installation is about changing hearts and minds. And installation time period is about us coming up with the idea of what do we need to learn. Now, I have often as a teacher, I was an assessment of learning person. But if we say assessment as learning and assessment of learning, or and or, assessment of learning is like a scoreboard, folks. It's summative. Assessment as learning is like a mirror. It's metacognitive. So this system is not less rigor. It's deeper learning and ownership. So start thinking a little bit about what does assessment as learning look like in your classroom? And perhaps stepping back and saying, I'm already doing this. In this unit, we do X, Y, and Z. Installation is the time period for you to be able to identify areas where you already might be having a combination of assessment of learning and assessment as learning already happening. But then you might say, for this unit, I definitely need to find a way to have assessment as learning. I dug into some of my my old English 11 things because I thought about the way I ran my classroom back then, and I always had options for students. So this made me think a little bit about New York Inspires. And I kind of redid this. So if you had an English 11 class and students had to choose 4 options to demonstrate proficiency, well, they could choose to take the Regents exam, January, June, or August, and they could choose, to do a benchmarked reading comprehension exam, but then they also need to choose 2 more things. And those 2 other things would be transfer-based assessments, like an artistic interpretation, a portfolio, a podcast or a video, the creation of a storyboard, comic strip, writing or editing for an outside publication. There's lots of things that could happen. But it just made me think a little bit about if I were teaching right now, what might it look like in my classroom? Each of you have to determine what can it look like in your classroom. Segment 5, to me, is one of the bigger lifts, and that this is one of the bigger lifts because this is where New York State is going to be working to redefine credits and learning experiences, including the learning experience in the sense of time, seat time. And is time a measure of learning, or is time a resource? So, time is a resource, not a measure of learning in New York Inspires. The requirements, the Part 100 requirements about credits, about seat time, about 1 diploma, high-stakes assessments, and what program and instructional requirements are going to be required. This all is part of a transformational change. We have received preliminary guidance, but not approved by the New York State Board of Regents yet, that time as a resource will mean that seat time will change. It won't continue to be 180 minutes required to earn a credit. Carnegie units will not be the measure of a credit. Instead, credit will be obtained by competency, by readiness, by meeting standards, which, quite frankly, folks, it takes people all different sets of time to meet a standard. Many of us feel rushed. I know when I was teaching, global history, I might say Peloponnesian War, and we'll cover that for the next 5 minutes because I have to move to the next war. This is a lot about our content and our curriculum. Instead of being, inch deep and a mile wide, the opposite. That prioritize standards will be a mile deep and deeper learning. So when we take a look at this more fully, what could you be doing now? Designing learning that builds transferable skills. Where can you use interdisciplinary connections? Where are they obvious between science and math and English and social studies? And what new courses could be developed if we are now going to have to be worried about a Regents exam being the end game? And instead, the end game is learning standards, the idea that some prioritized standards need to be met. If we focus on instructional design and collaboration, incorporating real-world tasks, scenarios, or problems, and making skill development explicit during lessons, those are things we could be thinking about right now when it comes to some of the educational requirements. What about that idea of time being flexible? Time being flexible isn't about having chaos, but we all know we have students who, quite frankly, are advanced or behind our typical instructional pace, and we move forward, or we do not have enough time and effort and energy to come up with the enrichment activities that we need for a student who might be advanced in our content area. So how do we become creative and use time and teams and resources more flexibly to meet students' needs? Do we share students across teachers? Do our school schedules change to allow for flexibility? Are we pooling expertise, not just rosters? And do we have teachers that rotate based on student need, not fixed class ownership? Are we going to share? We expect the elementary kids to share. Are we going to share our resources and our spaces? This means intentional flexibility, using people, time, and spaces in a smarter way so students can show learning when they are ready. So now is a time for us to be thinking about how schedules and structures can best support student needs. Now, currently in New York State, we have 3 diplomas. We have the local diploma, we have a Regents diploma, and we have a Regents diploma with advanced designation. Us having 3 diplomas can be very confusing to college, to employer, to the military, et cetera. With 1 diploma, students will have multiple ways to demonstrate readiness, and they'll have multiple pathways. And those pathways could result in seals and endorsements on the 1 diploma. So that is what will distinguish one student from another student. Additionally, the 1 transcript will then have more in-depth information about a student's readiness. Now, when determining how many credits a student might need to earn that 1 diploma, the state is currently working on what credit requirements will be a part of New York Inspires. And what we have heard is that certain areas will be combined, like science and math credit requirements might fall under a STEM title, and maybe English and social studies will fall under a humanities label, and that maybe some students need a certain number of credits and other students need a different level of credits. In addition to credits for a diploma, New York State is looking at different required content areas. So not things that necessarily result in credit, but it results in exposure to standards in certain areas that all of the Blue Ribbon Commission information said parents, schools, kids, teachers say should be required information for all students. So we have some new requirements coming forth soon in financial literacy and in areas of climate education. It's already been discussed that all students in high school will have to have one CTE credit, which currently does not exist in our system. The diploma requirements also emphasize the need for work-based learning, internships, for students to have career exposure, not just at the high school, middle school, at the elementary, that the development of the idea about career needs to be more dramatic and it needs to happen at younger ages. So all of this is are parts of what we'll be hearing about over the next several years about how a diploma will be determined in New York State moving forward. And I think what you probably would be hearing is a lot more flexibility and a lot more opportunity for student agency and choice, and a lot more trust in teachers and in their pedagogy than maybe we had heard in the past. Now, something that is often asked when I present is, that people will stop and say, you haven't mentioned anything about students with disabilities. And I'm a special ed teacher, and I'm feeling really nervous right now when you talk about the fact that seat time's going away, and maybe classes don't have to be 44 minutes, and every class doesn't have the same number of minutes. And, how do I write an IEP if the minutes of classes are varied all around a school district? What does this look like for students with disabilities? So it's really important for us to remember that in our system, we have some things that are state requirements and some things that are federal requirements. So we know that an IEP has federal requirements. So IEP services in a flexible time system. So what's going to stay the same? There's still going to be required minutes. There's still going to be services that have to be delivered by qualified providers. We're still going to be required to do documentation and progress monitoring, and we have to remain in compliance with IDEA and NYSED regulations. But what can change? When and where those minutes are delivered can change. How services integrate into a flexible instructional block can be a change. It makes perfect sense that in a system that is saying there should be more interdisciplinary teaching, that there would be increased co-teaching and push-in opportunities. And finally, a more responsive schedule will align much better with student readiness. And the readiness and the varying degrees of readiness by content area for students with disabilities. I know we'll be getting more information about students with disabilities, but I definitely did not want to conclude this presentation without at least sharing with you that there is thought going into this. People will also ask me about the alternative assessment students. We have not had fully clarified guidance on that yet, but it is forthcoming. So for us to take a moment to step back and recap a little bit. This is all hands on deck. And in our audience today, in many school districts, we have teaching assistants. And I really think that it's the time that if we are not using and assigning our teaching assistants in strong instructional roles, that now is the time, because with an all-hands-on-deck system, that New York Inspires expands the definition of student success. And that expansion increases the importance of every single adult who supports students. And it's very typical that teachers are going to need the assistant of their teaching assistants, and our students are going to need their teaching assistants more than ever as they creatively try to develop their own pathways. So remember, when we say pathways, we're talking about pathways that are pathways to graduation and to career, and pathways to your credits, and pathways to how you meet standards. So teaching assistants are going to actually be elevated, in my opinion, in instruction, as they should be. So remember, it's all hands on deck for us to get to 2029 and be ready for New York Inspires. So lots of things that I've talked about today might sound really familiar to you, and you might feel like, I've done that, I can do that. But know that this is a major shift, folks. This has to be deeply and consistently implemented across every part of our system with K-12, and not in isolated practices, not in one or two particular classrooms. That every student, regardless of identity or zip code, deserves opportunities and deserves the best opportunity to become a graduate of New York State schools. So access to opportunities varies widely across our state, varies widely across our county, and for specific groups of students. New York Inspires is challenging us to change that. How do students, regardless of who they are or where they live, get the best education possible that's equitable? And that means, how do we look around our county and see how we share resources so that all students can have that equitable education? So I'll end today by saying, in my opinion, this is absolutely an exciting time to be in education because it elevates the work educators already do. It supports deeper learning, professional judgment, and meaningful outcomes for every student. New York Inspires brings coherence, equity, purpose, and possibility to your classrooms. And I encourage you all, even if this has felt a little overwhelming today, to be thinking about the inspiration, the possibility, the actual ability to transform education, and maybe bringing you back to the reason you became an educator in the first place. Thank you for being with me today. Your facilitators certainly may have additional questions and activities for you, and we will be putting out additional videos from CiTi BOCES to support you as we go through the phased-in implementation of New York Inspires. Have a great day, everybody.